Good morning. Today we're going to talk about the business of writing. So we're going to go into some basics of the different publishing choices that you have right now, and then into specifics about how you find editors, agents, publishers, and that kind of thing. So mostly today we're going to talk about book publishing, but I'll give you a little bit background on shorter stories. So for books, there's traditional publishing, self-publishing, and then there's a form they call hybrid publishing, which is a combination of the two. Literary or small press publishing, those are all options for publishing books, whether it's a memoir, true story, true crime, nonfiction. All of that falls under those different formats. And then if you have shorter projects like stories, articles, essays, even poetry, you're going to look for literary journals, magazines, and blogs will be your primary source for publication. This is what the traditional process looks like, and that has changed significantly over the years. So I'm going to give you some alternatives to this. So the traditional process starts with a polished manuscript, and it doesn't matter if you're independently publishing, traditionally publishing, writing for a small press, you have to have a completed manuscript when you start. So once you have the completed manuscript, it's polished and ready to go, then you're going to find a literary agent. We'll look at some places where you can find that. Literary agents then submit to publishers. The advantage they have is it goes directly to the editor agent and not into a slush pile. Then the publisher makes an offer and the agent negotiates the deal for you for a percentage of the cost. It can be anywhere between 15 and 20% that the agent takes. And then the publisher suggests, I love the word suggest because really at this point you don't have a lot of choice, edits, and they work on putting the book together for you. They prepare the marketing and the sales. So they're laying out the bigger expenses. They're paying for the cost of book formatting, book cover, branding, marketing, distribution. All of that is taken care of by the publisher. So they do get particularly in a traditional contract on a print book, they do get the lion's share because they're taking the largest financial risk. And then it says the book is published. Now, from my own personal experience, it's a long process. Oftentimes, book publication dates are a year to 18 months out, sometimes longer, depending on the publisher. So when it says book is published, it's a process. It's not immediate. An alternative. So there are a lot of smaller publishers now that will take submissions directly from writers. This is true for small presses, for academic presses or university presses. It's also true for some alternative presses, particularly because there is a expressed need and desire for more diverse writers. Sometimes publishers are allowing writers to submit directly to them. So this is the process I chose. I went specifically with the small press. I had researched them. I knew they were created by women writers who were tired of traditional publishers taking such a large percentage, particularly when it came to ebook publishing, because they didn't have the same expenses. So why were traditional publishers taking the same ridiculous percentage? So I knew going in what they call the boilerplate contract looked like. I knew I didn't need an agent. And so I submitted directly to them. So you start with a polished manuscript, and then you submit directly to them. And then it says publisher makes an offer and negotiates a deal. This would be great. In truth, it took, I think, more than a year for this process to go through because they pay readers to go through what they call the slush pile of unsolicited manuscripts. And then those are the people who, if they find a book that they think is worth publication, then they move it up the chain. So most likely when you do this process, you're not being read by the editor and agent. Now, there are some times when that wouldn't be true. If the editor requested your manuscript because you'd met somewhere or spoken previously, then they might actually be the ones who were going to read your manuscript. And then so then the reader read it. They put it up the chain to the editor. In my case, the editor ended up leaving the company right before I went to contract. So then I had to go through the whole process again. If you don't know, I made a point of educating myself on contracts, specifically this contract, which pieces of the contract were negotiable, which ones were not. So I was comfortable negotiating. And because it was a small press built by writers, they weren't, there weren't terms in there that were punishing to the writer, which is one of the reasons I chose them. But if you don't know the process, don't sign a contract without sending it through an attorney. And you can find literary attorneys. I live in Colorado Springs, and I have a friend who actually had to go talk to a literary attorney because they didn't in the first set. So she was published by a very small press that turned out to be something of a scam. And they were trying to take any books that she had written within 3 years of publishing her first book. And I think the most she made off of that publisher was like $50. And they were trying to get the rights for the rest of her books. So then she had to go back, and out of her own money, which that $50 that she got out of the publisher certainly didn't cover the literary attorney, to get legal recourse against a bad contract. So make sure you hire the literary attorney up front. And it should be a literary attorney. You may have a family friend who is an attorney who can view it for you, but literary attorneys are familiar with the kinds of contract terms that are normal and which ones are predatory. And so that's something that you need to take into account. So then once you have a contract and you've made the deal and you've signed the contract, the publisher is going to suggest edits. For me, this was probably the very first time. It was probably thousands of things that I had to work on. And we'll go into the different kinds of editors when we look at hybrid publishing. But it goes through several edits and several people before they put the book together, and they prepare the marketing and sales and publish the book. We now have the option to self-publish. And I think this is one of the best things that that's happened to the book industry, because oftentimes the gatekeepers are moved by trends or the need for profit. And publishing, in my opinion, shouldn't be wholly profit-based. Like, it should be merit-based, I guess, is what I think. So self-publishing sort of democratizes the whole process. And so you have a polished manuscript to start off with, and then you are responsible for hiring editors. And so let me give you a sense for the kind of editors that typically you hire. A content editor, depending, costs anywhere between $1,000 and $2,000, and they go through and they look at the big picture items. So when I work with my publisher, that's my initial editor goes through and says, this works, this doesn't work, change this, fix this. And it depends on the particular line that you're going for, what kind of content edits they suggest. And it can be kind of comprehensive. I had to, in one of my books, change a character name because they just published a manuscript with that name in it, and they didn't want to have the same name that recently. It was weird. And I ended up liking the new name better, but it was disconcerting. And then when you work with the publisher, it also goes to then the managing editor after you finish those content edits. But as a self-published writer, you wouldn't need to do that. Then you need to hire a copy editor. The copy editor is the one who goes through and checks your grammar. Don't skip them. They are worth their weight in gold. They catch all the mistakes that you think there's no possible way there's any more mistakes in there, and they find them because your eyes are so used to looking at these words, you don't see them. So a copy editor is invaluable. Then you have a proofreader who does much the same. The proofreader shouldn't change your grammar, although I know mine frequently tries, and it was ironic because the commas that the copy editor put in, the proofreader wanted to take out. So it was kind of a back and forth between them. But the proofreader is there for a couple things. One, to catch all those mistakes, because we've had all those eyes and all those hands in your manuscript. You need somebody who's going to make sure that you didn't leave half sentences or tail ends of sentences that you're supposed to delete. So they are doing the final continuity. And this, for traditional publishing, this happens right before the galleys go out. The other thing the proofreader does is each publisher has what they call a style sheet. So for instance, my publisher, if a word is a sound, they italicize it. So there's certain ways that publishers, they have one style sheet that's true for all of their books, and the proofreader is the one who applies the style sheet. And then for self-published writers, one thing that is a good idea is beta readers. And beta readers are readers in your genre who are reading as readers and not as editors. And one of the things beta readers can do for you is help you improve, but they also can write your original reviews when you first release a book. So they're important people in your life if and when you get to that point. Then you either hire out or complete book formatting, and there are specific formats for, of course, it all has to be proprietary. Amazon has their own format. Barnes & Noble has their own format. iTunes has their own format. Google Play has their own format. Kobo has their own format. I actually have a piece of software that it's called Vellum, Vellum. It's for Macs. I want to say when I bought it, it was about $100, but it will do all the formatting for me. I just import a Word document that has the whole manuscript in it. But you can also hire that out. And when I first started, I actually hired out my book formatting. The cover design, I highly recommend that you get a professional cover designer. We know what looks good, but they know what sells. And part of it is branding and making sure the branding is consistent. Part of it is knowing the genre. Like, I wouldn't hire a science fiction fantasy cover artist to write my covers because mine are very suspenseful and theirs would be more world building and fantastical. So make sure that you hire professionals to do those things. And then you can upload then to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all of the other sources that I talked about. There are also companies that will do that for you. Like for a very small percentage, you upload to them and they submit it everywhere, except for Amazon, because Amazon doesn't let anybody play with their toys, essentially. And then at that point, your book is published. With Amazon and most of the others, you can do pre-orders, which means you set a date that you're going to release it to get pre-orders on the book. If you do that, if you choose to do that, make sure that the book is finished, because if your book does not come out at the day, now this isn't true for traditional publishing, right? But it's true for independent publishers or self-published people. They will punish you by not allowing you to do pre-orders for a year. So make sure the book is complete and ready to go before you do a pre-order. So that's self-published. And then there's hybrid, and this is actually where I fall. I originally was traditionally published. I liked my publisher. I liked my 3 books. I thought they treated me well, but I went through, I think, at least 2 editors there, maybe 3. And my last editor actually lived here in Colorado Springs, and we got along really, really well. She liked my writing. We had a strong working relationship. And so when she left the publisher, and I never really knew how or why she left, but when she left, I decided that I wanted to try indie publishing. And indie publishing is where you are responsible for all the outlay. And I would say minimum that I spend on each book that I release is probably $2,500, sometimes closer to $3,000 or $4,000. So you have to weigh the cost versus the returns, right? The advantage is Barnes & Noble and Amazon and those places are not going to take such a large percentage of the cover price, so you earn more back on the other end. So you have to figure out which balances or which makes the most sense for you. For the way publishing is kind of weird, you have to be successful before they put any marketing behind you, really. And so I felt very forgotten. Forgotten's not the right word. The book felt very underwhelming as far as the releases went. They weren't promoted in the same way as others. That's not a judgment of quality, it's usually a judgment of marketability. And so you put the money behind the ones that are most likely to make the most money, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I wanted to do a split comparison. I had written 3 books and a novella for my traditional publisher, and I wanted to do then 3 books and a novella independently or as an indie published author. And, I needed that initial traditional contract for me to know that somebody else out there thought my writing was worth something. But then I needed to think about what was best for me and my family financially. Not to say that I think book publishing and writing is about money, but you do have to consider that. Now, I wouldn't indie publish memoir, I don't think, because that's a very niche market and it's hard to reach people, and you need the publisher for those things. There are certain things I wouldn't indie publish. I have a literary novel that I won't indie publish because it needs a traditional publisher. But it's good to explore your options and to know what's available for you out there, and that you can do both. My publisher never had a problem, and you have to make sure your contract says this, but my contract was open enough that I could indie publish in addition to the books that I released with them. The only thing in there for my contract was I couldn't directly compete. So I couldn't release a book at from an indie and a traditionally published at the same time, because then I was competing against myself and technically competing against my publisher. So that's what a hybrid author is. That's another option that you can go. And then some of you know, because you've been in previous classes, I also write creative nonfiction and memoir, and that's another one where instead of going traditional published, I would probably go university press or small press for that, and we'll look at ways that you can find those publishers. So we're going to look at the process of who, what, when, where, why, and how to get your work out into the world. And we're looking specifically at books, but if you guys are interested in the smaller forms like short stories, poetry, just let me know and I'll look at adding that to the schedule. All right, so initially, if you're going to traditional publishing, you are submitting either directly to an editor or to an agent. And while traditionally they recommend getting an agent first, realistically, that's a hard, agents are hard to get. And you just have to find the right person on the right day. It is very subjective. If you've ever read Stephen King's book on writing well, it's like a how-to writing, but also sort of memoir. And he talks about the fact that he had so many rejections, the nail fell off the wall and he had to get a bigger nail. Rejection is part of this business. So editors and agents are who you're going to want to target first. And for a book, you're going to need a synopsis, which is, depending on the publisher, 2 to 3 pages, a maximum of 10 pages, that is a summary told in third person of your book. It doesn't matter if your book's first person, you always tell it third person. And so you use a synopsis for fiction and memoir, and then for nonfiction, you would use a proposal. And so hopefully in a future workshop, we'll talk about how to write a synopsis or how to write a proposal. You're going to write a query letter. If you're meeting in person, you would do a pitch, which is comparable to a query letter. And then personal contact and networking. If you know somebody who knows somebody, like anything else in life, that's the best way to get published. When you have to have a completed manuscript, particularly as an unpublished author, for fiction and memoir, you do need the completed manuscript. A lot of times an editor or agent won't speak to you until it's finished because they need to know you have the ability to finish it. And then if potentially you have an editor and agent ask for a partial. A partial is typically 3 chapters and a synopsis, or the first 50 pages and a synopsis. The times where this would come into play would be something like a nonfiction proposal. If you have multiple books by the same publisher, like my second and third books with my publisher could have been sold on a partial, I'm a little pig-headed, so I wrote the whole book, partly because I didn't want the pressure of knowing that I had to meet a certain deadline and stressing myself out, just because I tend to overwork myself or overschedule myself. So I wrote the full books, but I could have sold on a partial manuscript. And then if you're switching publishers or genres, but you have a very strong backlist, if Stephen King wanted to change publishers, he doesn't have to write the whole manuscript. He could just sell in his name, but the rest of us would probably need 3 chapters and a synopsis to get started. So where do you find editors and agents? Writers' conferences are one of your best bet once you have a finished manuscript. So until you have a finished manuscript, you go to writers' conferences to learn more about the craft, and it's an invaluable experience, most of them. But once you have a finished manuscript, then you're also going for networking opportunities and a chance for an editor and agent appointment. And most conferences offer an editor or agent appointment. They're called pitch sessions. They're usually 10 minutes max, and in 10 minutes you've got to sell your idea. And really you're selling yourself. And by that I mean you're selling who you are, like you have enough personality to make the face-to-face memorable so that you are more likely to get published. Another place that you can look for when you're ready to submit are contests. Oftentimes the final judge is an editor or an agent. Then you can go the unsolicited submission route. So not all publishers do. You have to look at their submission guidelines. But if they take unsolicited submissions, you can submit directly to the publisher. And then again, the best way is to know someone. All right, we'll look specifically as we have time at some of these, but there are many places to look for editors or agents. One that's not on the list that I want to go over first is if you have a particular book in your genre that you love and you think is very similar to yours. First of all, you need to know that they're called comparables, and that most editors and agents want to know what your book is comparable to, so they know there's a market for it. But many times if you see a book like that and you look through their acknowledgments, you'll see who their editor or agent are. And so that gives you a sense of people who publish what you publish. But there's 3 different places that I want to recommend. And I'm going to start from the bottom up. Publishers Lunch really it's a larger publishers marketplace, but there's a lot of information about publishers available at Publishers Lunch. Jane Friedman also runs the Hot Sheet, which is similar to Publishers Lunch, and both of those are subscriptions. So that's why I'm starting at the bottom, because the bottom 2 require some sort of financial investment. Writers Market has been around for as long as I know. Writers Market is a book filled with publishers, publications, magazines, and an index that tells you, the perfect storm of how to find the perfect place for your work. Right now, it's been bought by Penguin. So the link that you see there, it's active, but Penguin just purchased Writers Market. So as they switch it over, we don't know what's going to look like on the other side. The one I want to recommend, and if we have time today, I will show you, is Query Tracker, because Query Tracker has a free version and a subscription version. It was written, I think, by a writer who just wanted a place to track editors and agents as he was making submissions. They have a free version that I used for years, and then now I subscribe for like $25 a year. It allows me to keep track of who I submit to, which I have to admit, I have been known to submit to the same editor or agent twice because I didn't have a good list, and so it has a tracker in there for you. But it also has a search function. You can search by genre, gender, location. So if you want a Canadian publisher, you can look for that. If you want a male publisher, you can look for that. So Query Tracker is the one that I use the most frequently because it's free, it's updated, and it keeps stats for it. Once you have the pay version, you can look at stats and see how often does this editor or agent respond? How often do they respond positively? What kind of responses it take them? 6 months to get back to you or 2 weeks? Those are things you need to know. And then I would say, just as a general rule, when I am in the submission process, I keep several out at a time so that if I get a rejection, I am not wounded and want to crawl into my own cupboard because I know I have other submissions out there still. Book comps. So Every editor and agent, when you speak to them directly or when you write them a query letter, wants to know what books are comparable. So it's your job to know what has been published recently that is like your book. And if your book, I know we've talked about In Cold Blood, by Truman Capote. I consider that one of the best works of creative nonfiction, but it's very old. So if you're going to compare your work to something that's old, you need to make sure you have something comparable that's new as well. Because what they really need to see, I've seen a lot of science fiction writers who say their book is like Tolkien. Well, great, but Tolkien's work is very dated and it has a certain audience. And what he got away with, contemporary writers probably can't get away with. So if you're going to compare yourself to Tolkien, two things. You're setting yourself up for failure because it's Tolkien. But then also, publishers need to know that there's somebody in the contemporary marketplace that wants to buy a book like yours. And so you need to have a book, preferably within the last 2 years, but no more than the last 5 years, that you think is comparable to your book. And what you're telling them is, this is a book that's similar to mine that's published, so we can market it to the same group of people, is essentially what you're telling them. You're not saying you're a copycat. And how you find them is to read prolifically in your market. You can also search on Amazon as a great tool for finding comparables. And you can also just go through your library of books of favorites that you have that you know your style is similar. You tend to read things like what you write, or hopefully you do. And then you're going to learn to write a query. I have a resource for that and how to write a synopsis or a proposal. We won't have time to do the synopsis or proposal, but we are going to practice writing a query letter here in a little bit. So all a query letter is a cover letter that you send. It's like putting a cover letter on your resume. In this case, your proposal is the resume and the query letter is your proposal. And I got the information that I'm about to share with you from Jane Friedman. She's the one I told you writes the hot sheet. She's been in the industry for a very long time. And so this is what she recommends for a query letter, and then we're going to practice this. So the stats. So that's your book's genre, category, word count, title, and subtitle, plus your comps. Stats are pretty important. If you don't know your genre, how are they expected? I teach undergraduate students, and I often tell them, if you can't find your thesis statement and you wrote this, how am I supposed to pull it out? You need to know your work well enough that you can state that. Usually it's a sentence or two at most that you get all of that information in there. You also need the hook, and the hook is comparable to your back cover copy that's on the back of that would be on the back of the book. It's just a description of your story that's intended to hook the editor or agent with the most critical parts of your story. It's 100 to 200 words. It's usually a paragraph to 2 paragraphs. It's not a lot. It's just enough to say, hey, why don't you read more of this? And then you do need something about your bio, something about yourself, very short. If you have publication credits, that goes in there. If your book's true crime and you're a detective, if it's true crime and you have family connections, all of that information goes in your bio. So if you don't have publications, think of other things that make you the right person to write this story. That's what would go in your bio. And then make sure you have a very professional closing at the end of the query. All right, so first I'm going to take questions on anything that I just went over, and then I'm going to prompt you guys on how to write a query letter. We're going to write the 4 elements together for the rest of class.